Sex Talk with Erica Miley. 'Cause sexuality is tough. And okay, sex just isn't good enough. No. Sex Talk with Erica Miley.
Hey folks, welcome to Sex Talk with Erica Miley. Erica Miley here. You all know that I like to bring people back that I just love to talk to, and I just respect this person so very much. I have, again, the wonderful Cyndi Darnell, sex and relationship therapist. I think I told you last time I have wanted to be you when I grow up. It has nothing to do with an age thing. I just really so respect what you do. So I'm just so glad to be here. I'm so glad to be here with you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, it's lovely to be back here, Erica. I love it.
So I specifically, you posted these two brand spanking new, a case report and another paper that you have published, and we're gonna jump right into them. You specifically did a case report and then a somatic and sex therapy and working in the body within the present moment, like bringing the body to the present. And so we're going to talk about all of those aspects and we're going to kind of bring them together. Y'all hang on. It's dense today. It's dense.
I'm all about the density, man. Bring it on.
So I really want to out the gate talk about how you reference the body experience of our daily lives and how it's downplayed, undervalued. I mean, when I read this, I thought about like every moment of not only just my life, my clients' lives, how frequently the experience of the body is just shoved aside. I know I mentioned before we started like diet culture and all of those things where the body and the actual experience of the body is ignored or we were told we're wrong. I want to talk about this a little bit. Like, how can we, as people, start to really come back to our bodies? And when we're up against a lot of messages that tell us otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is in recognizing that it's even happening, because a lot of us are kind of just brains on a stick. And we don't realize that we even have bodies. And one of the crucial things about having good sex is in the practice of being embodied, the practice of actually feeling your body. And we often think about sex as something that involves genitals and breasts and such, and it does. But sex is also about just being aware of the sensations of your body on a daily basis when you're just existing. So one of the first ways that people can practice being a bit more embodied, so, you know, that's a word that means to be in your body of sensation, is to just right now, as you're sitting, standing, listening, driving, whatever you're doing, listening to this podcast, notice the big toe on your right foot. Just notice what it's doing. Make a connection with it. And you might need to wiggle it. Yeah, you might need to wiggle it to break the connection, because even in that instant moment, you'll be like, oh, gosh, I actually can't feel my toe. You know, or it takes a couple of seconds for the mind and the toes to connect, because we spend most of our time not thinking about what our toes are doing, because we don't have to, unless there's pain there, then perhaps we're more aware of them. So now bring your attention to the back of your left knee.
There it is.
And then notice how long, notice how long it takes for that connection to happen. It's often, for a lot of folks, it's a few seconds. It's not instantaneous. And now bring your attention to your right armpit.
Got it.
And so I'm just picking these sort of random disparate parts of the body that we tend to not think about very much. But interestingly, the skills required to be able to have great sex are the exact same skills that we use to tune into our foot or our knee or our armpit. It's about bringing our attention to what the body is doing. And at this stage, all we're doing is addressing the surface level. We're just addressing, you know, the notion that an extremity is there, that there's a knee there, or that there's a toe or an armpit there. At deeper levels, we can actually dive in and go, well, can you feel the nail? Can you feel the bone? Can you feel the viscera? Can you feel the blood? But for our purposes, just as a beginner level practice, it's simply a matter of bringing awareness to the fact that we have a body. And if we do that, say, every 2 hours, for 30 seconds every day. That is a really rock solid practice of embodiment, which means that by the time you come around to having sex, partnered or solo, your body is going to be in a habit of being able to tune into itself. And so it's going to be less weird and less freaky to do in the middle of sex, because your body's going to be like, oh yeah, I know how to do this. And so starting to have an embodied practice just in your daily life is, I think, one of the most important things we can do to start having a somatic relationship with ourselves. So somatic means of the body. A somatic relationship with ourselves means we're not just brains on sticks. We're brains and bodies and sensations that are capable of extraordinary pleasure if we learn how to use the instrument that we live in. Sorry about the noise outside. It's New York City.
Hey, we're doing our best. It's just, we're gonna have sound. Like, we can't help it. We've all been home for so long, or not out and about as like, oh, there's city sounds. Look at that.
Exactly.
Not just brains on sticks. I'm typing that down, because I think that you're pulling out something that is incredibly important to the practice of something I work with my clients a lot, which is mindfulness. It's not just sitting on a cushion trying to make your mind blank, because that's not what the mind does. It's a machine made to think. It's going to keep running until we're dead. So you're asking essentially, like, your clients to turn on that curiosity muscle. That's, I'm going to become the observer of my own physical experience. And in the least complicated way that you possibly can, especially when you're beginning. And I just think that that's lovely.
Yeah, and it's something that people can do. That, there's this sort of, when people think it's therapy, it's sex therapy, it's going to be heavy and scary and freaky and intense. And I mean, sometimes it can be all of those things, but it can also be as simple as bringing your attention to your knee. And just noticing what you feel, noticing things like texture and temperature. And then as you bring your attention to it, does it change a little bit? Once you start paying attention to it, then it's like, oh gosh, I'm a bit itchy, actually. I need to scratch it. And just sort of, we call it tracking the sensations as they move around the body allows us to develop a relationship with this instrument. Because, I relate to our bodies as instruments. We've got to learn how to play them.
Oh, my inner musician just my heart went pitter pat, Cyndi, just pitter pat. Seriously, I know you do as well. I work with a lot of folks with body image issues or body issues generally, chronic illness, and like you, I have found the cognitive based treatments for mental health really fundamentally inadequate, and I'm not like coming for any of my CBT folks out there. Like, I love y'all. Y'all are working hard. I get it. But I just find, especially with sexuality, with trauma, with many of these body issues that my clients face, that they're just not enough. It's not wide enough. It's not big enough to hold all of the things. So I find more body-based and mindfulness-based treatments more effective. So how do we bring the somatics into sex therapy and clinical mental health overall? Because I know there's people who are really concerned about, and I know you've read the papers too, the ethics of that. And I'm like, but this is bodies. How is it unethical? Okay, whatever. So
I think,
how do we do it?
Well, we're in a transitional phase, I think, with regard to traditional mental health therapy. So in my personal background, I trained originally as a mental health therapist, like a lot of folks did. And then over the years, then I sort of specialized in sex therapy. And now I've pretty much moved away from mental health therapy entirely for a variety of reasons, but the primary one being that I focus exclusively on sex and relationships. And so in that, the work that I'm doing now and the papers that I'm writing and offering training to clinicians around this is to really invite clinicians to say, all right, so we are trained in traditional psychotherapeutic models and in medicine and various things to look for problems. We're looking for diseases. We're looking for symptoms. We have to find a diagnosis before we can slap on a cure. The position of somatics is not to necessarily be looking for diseases, but to be looking for what is there. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a whole different way of paying attention to the client's needs, is that we're not necessarily looking for what's wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
we're looking for what is present. And then in some cases, we're also looking for what's right. Because the clients can have knowledge of this to say, well,
Mm.
my anxiety tends to recede when I'm taking a bath, or my anxiety recedes when I'm masturbating. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is how we end up sometimes with one of these bogus diagnoses like sex addiction, like someone who
Mm-hmm.
can't stop jerking off all the time. Oh, well, he must be a sex addict. We've got the clinical evidence to say now that that's all BS. But what we also know is that someone who's got an underlying sense of discomfort, or perhaps anxiety, who will self-soothe through some sort of
Mm-hmm.
erotic practice, that's a way that they have discovered to integrate their nervous system, their physical self, as a way of soothing the nervous system in the best way they know how, in a
Mm-hmm.
way that brings them pleasure. The bummer
Yeah.
with it is that they're doing it in such a way that's also causing them a little bit of grief.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about retraining them how to integrate the good work that they're doing with their body, is that they recognize masturbation is a pleasure tool. They recognize masturbation is a nerve tonic. It soothes us.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need to recognize that teaching clients how to use their bodies in such a way that we bring that knowledge and wisdom forward also
Mm.
empowers them and takes them away from this traditional model that we get taught in therapy school about looking for problems and looking for diagnoses, and
Mm-hmm.
especially in the US, where a diagnosis means an insurance code
Yep.
and is not necessarily connected to the client's
Mm-hmm.
well-being. And so
Absolutely.
this is where somatics really sort of sits outside the square, because it doesn't necessarily take a pathologizing view. It looks at sex, especially in context of how the client lives. And I know that we would do that in a mental health context as well, but then people get really icky when it's
Mm-hmm.
sex therapy and
Yeah.
somatics, because then we think, well, how is that different than sex work?
Yeah.
Which is a whole other discussion,
Right.
right? But people are okay talking about sex and somatics if there's trauma involved. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, as long as someone's in pain, we can talk about somatics. But we start talking about sex and somatics and pleasure, and people lose their minds, because that's
Yeah.
terrifying. Apparently, it's okay to talk about sex with pain, and it's not okay to talk about sex with pleasure when we're incorporating somatics. And this is a cultural shift that needs
Mm-hmm.
to change. And so the
Absolutely.
papers that I have written are really about bringing that argument forward and saying, perhaps we as clinicians have the wrong end of the deal. And
Mm-hmm.
perhaps we need to rethink our relationship with the shame that's embedded in how we see the body. And instead of privileging the intellect over the body, perhaps we can incorporate it, not get rid of the intellect. The intellect has its purpose.
Mm-hmm.
CBT has a purpose. All the cognitive therapies have a purpose. I'm also trained in narrative therapy, very cognitive.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be able to bring the somatics into it to get a robust understanding of what the client's experience is like being in the world, especially with sex, because sex happens in the body. Even if it's a solo practice, it's still happening in the body.
Absolutely. And you brought so clearly forward that therapists and psychologists and any one of us who is working in any kind of the helping capacity for mental and sexual health, that we were not unscathed by the cultural views of shame around sex. And
Hmm.
it's very clear in what you're talking about, like
Yeah.
that pleasure cannot be the reason. Having worked with those who've committed sexual crimes, even within that setting, in the prison setting, there was this idea of sex as coping,
Right.
and that it was a negative issue, that it
Right.
was a negative thing. It was something to make sure that they were not doing or using. And I could never understand that perspective, especially from the perspective of not harming another person, one, and two, the idea that no one in the mental health field has ever seen somebody who is dealing with schizophrenia masturbating to try to cope with a severe psychosis episode. with masturbation and seeing that as something that is something they should not do. When it, for many of us, from the time we were born, that may have been one of our first coping mechanisms that we ever learned.
Yeah.
And so I just think you're placing a light on something that is so needed and necessary. So let's bring it into pain. Let's talk specifically about there's terrible language around this diagnosis specifically,
Right.
which so we're gonna say GPP/PD, and it's awful. Like nobody wants to say that they have this disorder. Like because when did it change? What, DSM-5?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
they took out vaginismus and vulvodynia and dyspareunia and squished them all together into this GPP/PD, which is genitopelvic pain penetration disorder, which is a lot of words and a lot of fricatives, and it's really not very pleasant.
So many P's.
So many P's. And even the penetrate, just all of it. It's just a lech. It's a phrase I would never use outside of having to, because I'm writing about it.
Yeah, exactly. So
but it used to be called vaginismus, or it used to be called dyspareunia, or it used to be called vulvodynia, and now it's called this.
And when clients come to me, they use those words. They use vulvodynia. They use they're not using GPP/PD.
Yeah.
They're not. I would bet we're gonna see a change again. I'm sure, because all of us are gonna be like, that was a mistake. Anyway, I'm gonna read. It's a bit of a long quote, but I think it's really important, because you talk specifically about the connection between the experience of pain during sex to our fight or flight or freeze system, or the alarm system of the brain. And it's so very true in my work and the work that I've done around physical and sexual abuse. And you said that it correlates less to the presence of GPP/PD, so many P's, than historical emotional abuse and neglect, indicating that the traumatized response may appear physiologically as an anxiety/protection response. So the alarm system, again, and to an erotically hostile culture, which I want that on a t-shirt. I want that. I live in an erotically hostile culture, or a lack of awareness of sexual pleasure/education, rather than a solely a response to a single traumatic event. And this is what, over and over again, this is what I hear from my people. My partner didn't traumatize me. Why am I experiencing this? I want to experience pleasure during sex. Why can't I just do this? That is that sentence. Yeah. All the time.
That's what I hear also, the same.
I really do want to hear from you, like, as much as you and I read research all the time, and you have beautifully written research here, how do we break this down for maybe the average person experiencing this, or maybe even another clinician who hasn't read this?
So basically what I discovered in researching the prevalence of, let's say, vaginal pain with penis and vagina intercourse, that's really specifically what I was talking about in that paper. What, across a multitude of studies, what I discovered was that while sexual abuse is definitely a thing, and early childhood sexual abuse is also definitely a thing, there didn't appear to be, across multiple studies, there didn't appear to be a direct relationship between women and girls who had been sexually abused and the presence of painful intercourse. What did seem to have a stronger correlation was women and girls who had grown up in religious families, women and girls who had grown up with a domineering parent, women and girls who did not have any sex education, and women and girls who felt alienated from their bodies and from pleasure. That had a much, much, much higher correlation than the presence of a direct sexually abusive scenario where somebody could say everything was fine and then I was sexually assaulted and then everything was downhill after that. Not to say that being the recipient of a sexual assault has no effect. I'm just saying the effect may not be painful penetration.
Right.
There may be other effects. So we're looking very specifically at penis and again, very specifically at penis and vagina intercourse among heterosexual couples. So what we can sort of deduce from that is that old narrative of, if a woman's not enjoying sex, it must be because she's been sexually abused or sexually assaulted, or that there's something wrong with her. When what we can really see coming through in the current round of research is that this is starting to overwhelmingly look like a social phenomenon, a social problem, rather than a problem with any given individual. That, I mean, if I dare say it, it is sort of descending from patriarchy. This is really a problem of patriarchy.
I was just going to ask you. I just think that this is so deeply, and so many of my clients who have experienced this, we talk about powerlessness.
Yeah.
What happens for your body when you experience or perceive powerlessness?
Right.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perhaps even more complicated than powerlessness. It's a combination of powerlessness, for sure. Powerlessness, and also just not having any information, not having any education, which I guess in a way is designed to keep you powerless, because if we keep you ignorant and docile, then by association you're going to be powerless. So
you're going to be much easier to control.
Absolutely. And then this sort of really piggybacks onto the back of slut shaming narratives and all this kind of purity culture and all of these things that are still rife, even though we're probably living in the most progressive times of human history. Still, yes, women feel overwhelmingly that sex is not theirs to own. It's changing. It's definitely changing. It's certainly better than it was even 10 years ago. But we need to start looking at painful intercourse, GPPPD.
The P disorder or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it is a P disorder. It's a patriarchy disorder. Yeah, as a social phenomenon rather than an individual shortcoming. Now, this is also very specifically in women who have had thorough gynecological and medical assessments, and they have determined that there is no physiological reason for it. Sometimes it does have a physiological root if there was a complicated vaginal birth, or something else had happened, or there's some sort of shift in the pelvic bones that is causing cramping. That's a legitimate thing as well, but that's not what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about women who have had medical assessments that have come up with, we don't know, then that's when they would come to somebody like me or you potentially and start saying, well, I don't know what's wrong. And then we would have to start looking at it through the lens of getting in touch with your body, learning how to bring, so that same practice of what we did with the toes and the knees and the armpits, a practice like that, but then also sort of scaling up over a period of time, scaling up to have a very similar practice in your relationship with your genitals. And that can take time, especially if we're unpacking, thousands of years of cultural conditioning that vaginas and vulvas are disgusting. And that sex is only for bad girls, and I'm not a bad girl, and if I do this, I'll go to hell, and all the other things that folks believe. So that's where this stuff comes from. Or
it's supposed to hurt your first time.
Right. That's another one too. And also that penis in vagina sex is the only valid form of sex a heterosexual woman can have. So all these kinds of things really feed into it. And so in terms of a treatment plan, I would often probably start working with the woman on her own, and then maybe invite the partner in a bit later, because this is cultural. Everybody needs to be informed. This is not like a secret woman's problem. This is a problem that the world has, or certainly the Western world. And to clarify too, I mean, the research that I was looking at, the only research I could find was on primarily on Western women. I didn't find any research on women from other cultural backgrounds. So it would be interesting to see if there was other stuff. I didn't find any, but the prevalence of this among non-Western cultures would be an interesting thing to read. If anybody's listening to this and has some, please get in touch with me. I'd like to read about it.
Same. All the socials will be available to you, because I would absolutely love to see that, because I do think we don't include the entirety of the cultural experience of our bodies when we are talking about especially when we are talking about the Western disease model.
Right. Yeah.
So
And that's the thing about, Western culture is erotically hostile. It's erotically hostile to men as well, I think, but it's especially erotically hostile to women.
Again, I want it on a shirt that I grew up in erotically hostile culture.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I just so appreciate that you have been willing to come and chat with me today, because these papers are wonderful. And if any folks out there want to find you and or work with you, how do they find you in this big old world?
So they should come to my website, which is CyndiDarnell.com, CyndiDarnell.com. I'm currently based in New York City. I'll be here certainly for the next 5 years, 10 years. I'm not planning on going anywhere. And I work with clients all over the world. I'm not bound by state rules. I'm a free bird. So wherever you live, I am accessible, obviously, and especially now with Zoom, everybody's Zooming, and the way that I work works perfectly well on Zoom as well. So it's interesting actually being able to do somatic work across a video platform. People are like, "Oh, how does that work?" I'm like, "It works. It's amazing." So yeah, on my website, all the stuff is there, and I'll have a book coming out next year, which is not about painful penetration. It is about libido, and I don't fully have a title for it yet, but the working title is "Fucking While You Don't Feel Like It," and
that's my vote. I'm just gonna pretend like that's the title of the book, even if it ends up being something different. I'm gonna be like, I'm gonna write on the inside of my copy, this is what it is.
This is what it was going to be. Fucking when you don't feel like it. So it's basically about that. So if you struggle with getting in the mood, libido, desire, all that stuff, it's going to be about that.
You are just such a blessing to us. Thank you again for coming on the show. And folks, thanks for sticking around to the end. You can find Cyndi anywhere. I'll make sure everything is in the show notes. And we will see you all next time.